The low hum of the ceiling fan did little to dissipate the tension in the living room. John sat on the edge of the couch, his face drowned in frustration. Amara stood near the dining table, her arms crossed, her calm demeanor masking the growing irritation beneath. Amara, I'm not asking for much, John began, his voice slightly raised. If you are going to the market, just tell me what you need the money for. A list doesn't take that much time to make. Amara let out a slow breath, her tone firm but measured. John, I've been doing this since we got married. You've never had complaints about how I manage the house. Why is this suddenly a problem? John leaned forward, gesturing with his hands for emphasis. Because it's not about complaints, it's about accountability. I'm not saying you're doing anything wrong, but what's the harm in being clear about where the money is going? Her expression hardened. The harm is that you're making it seem like I can't be trusted with something as simple as groceries. I'm your wife, not a child. Why should I have to explain every detail of what I'm buying? John stood abruptly, pacing the room. It's not about trust, Amara. It's about transparency. What if something comes up and I need to know how we are spending money? You act like I'm trying to control you. Amara raised an eyebrow, her voice sharper now. And you act like I'm incapable of running this home. John stopped pacing, turning to face her. You are not listening. This isn't just about today. It's about building habits for the future. Why are you so resistant to something so simple? Because it's unnecessary, John. Amara shot back, her calm composure giving way to frustration. You are making this a bigger issue than it needs to be. I shouldn't have to defend myself every time I ask for money for the house. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. John shook his head, his voice low but tinged with an anger. Fine, do whatever you want. Clearly my opinion doesn't matter. Amara's lips tightened as she picked up a glass of water from the table, her movements deliberate. And clearly, you don't trust me enough to do what I've always done without questioning me. Without another word, John stormed out of the living room and went outside, the door closing with a decisive thud. Amara remained by the dining table, her grip on the glass firm as she stared out of the window, her thoughts swelling with frustration and hurt. In the silence that followed, the distance between them felt heavier than the argument itself. Outside the apartment and down the hallway, John's chest tightened with frustration, his mind replaying the argument over and over. 2 years into marriage, and yet it felt like they were speaking entirely different languages. He loved Amara deeply, but moments like this made him question if he truly understood her. He walked briskly through the streets, the evening air doing little to cool the anger boiling inside him. Their plan to wait 3 years before having children had seemed wise at the time, a mutual decision to build a stable foundation first. But now, with unresolved tensions like this, John couldn't help but wonder if their relationship was as strong as they had believed. His feet eventually led him to a small, dimly lit drinking parlor at the edge of the neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, just a place to sit and think, or not think. John pushed the door open and made his way to an empty table in the corner. "Good evening, sir," the attendant greeted, approaching his table with a polite smile. John nodded, forcing a small smile in return. "Evening. Just bring me 2 bottles of beer, please. That'll be all for now." "Yes, sir, right away," the attendant replied before disappearing behind the counter. As John waited, he stared at the empty table in front of him, his thoughts spinning. He loved Amara, he truly did. She was everything he wanted in a wife. But these arguments were wearing him thin. Was he asking too much? Or was she stubborn to see his perspective? The attendant returned, setting the 2 bottles and a glass on the table. "Here you go, sir. Let me know if you need anything else." "Thanks," John said curtly, already opening the first bottle. The cold bitterness of the beer did little to calm the heat inside him. He leaned back in his chair, muttering under his breath, "I made the right choice." He wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure himself or state a fact. The attendant passed by again, this time pausing near his table. "Rough day, sir?" John looked up, startled by the question, then sighed. "You could say that. Marriage stuff." The attendant chuckled lightly. "Ah, marriage. My wife always says it's two stubborn people learning to share one roof. It gets easier though." "Does it?" John asked, his tone skeptical. The attendant shrugged with a knowing smile. "If you both want it to, it does. Enjoy your drink, sir." As the attendant walked away, John took another sip, his mind still restless. He wanted peace, but he wasn't sure how to reach it. And as much as he wished the alcohol would hold the solution, he knew it wouldn't. Leaning back in his chair with a deep sigh, he stared at the second bottle of beer still unopened. He had resolved to keep trying, to understand Amara better and find harmony in their marriage. But the path ahead still felt uncertain. He was lost in thought when the door to the drinking parlor swung open and a group of 3 men entered, their voices filling the room with boisterous energy. The men were loud, laughing and chatting as they found a table directly next to John. Their presence immediately disrupted the quiet hum of the parlor, drawing glances from the other patrons. "Barman, bring us 3 bottles of stout and pepper soup," one of them called, slapping the table lightly. "Make it quick, abeg, we are thirsty." As they waited for their order, their conversation shifted effortlessly into a debate. "Arsenal is playing the best football in the league this season," one of them said, leaning forward with a confident grin. "Their attacking style, the way they dominate possession, nobody is doing it like them." His friend scoffed loudly, waving a dismissive hand. "Abeg, leave that thing. Chelsea is miles ahead when it comes to structure and discipline. Arsenal might be flashy, but when it matters most, they choke." "You dey talk like say Chelsea never flopped before," the first man shot back, raising his voice slightly. "What happened last season, eh? Spending all that money and still finishing 6th. The third man chuckled, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair. "Both of you are wasting your time. Man City is clear of both your teams, Just accept it and drink your beer in peace." The parlor erupted in quiet laughter from nearby tables, and even John found himself smiling faintly at their banter. The debate between the two men continued, growing more animated with each passing moment. "Let's not forget who has more trophies," the Chelsea supporter said, jabbing his finger in the air. "Trophies don't play on the pitch," the Arsenal fan retorted. As their drinks arrived, the argument dissolved into laughter, their friendship evident even in their disagreements. John couldn't ignore the loud voices from the next table. Despite himself, he found his attention drawn to the animated discussion between the three men. What had started as a debate about Premier League football was now taking an unexpected turn. "You see, the coach is like the husband of the house," one of the men said, leaning forward to emphasize his point. "Whatever the coach says, the boys follow. That's how you win games. Same thing with marriage. Whatever the husband says, the wife must follow." The others nodded in agreement, their gestures exaggerated by the influence of the drinks in front of them. "True talk," another man chimed in. "The husband is the leader. No argument there. If the wife doesn't obey, how can there be peace in the house? It's like a team ignoring their coach. Disaster." John frowned slightly, his grip tightening around his bottle. Their words hit close to home, stirring the unresolved frustration that had brought him to the parlor in the first place. Then, the third man spoke, his tone darker, more forceful. "Me? I don't tolerate nonsense. If my wife tries to disobey, I'll beat her until she behaves. That's the only way to control a woman. You can't let them think they are in charge." All three men burst into laughter, nodding in agreement, as though they just shared a profound truth. John's stomach churned. He felt a mix of anger and unease at their crude declarations. Yet, beneath it all, their words lingered, feeding a small, unwelcomed part of him that craved control over his situation at home. The men continued their conversation, using football metaphors to justify their opinions. "If the players don't follow the coach's tactics, the whole team fails," one of them said. "That's marriage. Simple." John stared at his bottle, the words echoing in his mind. Was he failing as a coach in his own marriage? Was Amara's resistance a sign that he wasn't leading well enough? A war raged within him. Part of him rejected their logic, dismissing their conversation as nothing more than drunken chatter. Yet, another part, wounded by his unresolved argument with Amara, couldn't shake the thought that maybe he needed to be firmer, stronger, to avoid being undermined. Maybe they are right, he thought reluctantly. Maybe being too soft is the problem. He sipped the last of his beer, the bitterness blending with the growing sense of resolve in his chest. He had always prided himself on being a loving husband, but now doubts crept in. Was his patience being mistaken for weakness? Could firmness and even force be the key to earning Amara's respect and obedience? The thoughts felt foreign, wrong, yet strangely reassuring. He let it settle in his mind, wrapping around his frustration like a balm. After sitting in silence for a while, John paid for his drinks and left the parlor. The cool night air brushed against his face as he walked back home. The streets were quiet, illuminated by faint street lights. His steps were steady, but his thoughts churned. By the time he reached his apartment building, the clock had ticked past 10:30 p.m. John unlocked the door and stepped into the dimly lit living room. The house was silent, Amara likely in the bedroom. He stood there for a moment, his resolve hardening further. Things will change, he muttered under his breath, as though declaring it to the walls. He was tired of the arguments, the unresolved tensions. If the men at the drinking parlor were right, then it was time to take control of his home, no matter what it took. On the table sat a plate of food, neatly covered, waiting for him. He paused, staring at the food for a moment, but his anger hadn't subsided. The conversation at the drinking parlor had done little to bring him peace, and he wasn't ready to confront Amara. Not tonight. Without lifting the cover or even glancing towards the bedroom where she likely waited, John walked past the table. The guest room felt colder, emptier, but it suited his mood. He shut the door behind him, the quiet click echoing in the stillness of the night. As he sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the day replayed in his mind. The argument, the loud men at the parlor, their words still resonating. His stomach growled faintly, but he ignored it, refusing to touch the food she'd prepared. Pulling the sheets over himself, John turned away from the door, letting the darkness and silence engulf him. Tonight, he chose distance over resolution. The morning sunlight streamed softly through the curtains as Amara opened the door to the guest room. She had barely slept the previous night, her mind consumed by the unresolved argument with John. Seeing the untouched plate of food on the dining table had only made her feel worse. She wanted to set things right. Inside the guest room, John was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, buttoning his work shirt. He didn't look up as she entered.
"Good morning,"
Amara began, her voice tinged with regret. John muttered a low "morning" without meeting her eyes, his hands continuing their task. Amara took a cautious step closer.
"I'm really sorry about yesterday, John. I don't like us having issues. It's not good for us, for our home."
He finally glanced at her but said nothing, his expression unreadable.
"I know you felt disrespected,"
she continued, her tone soft and conciliatory.
"But John, refusing to eat dinner, it hurts me. In as much as I don't think giving you detailed list for everything is right. I hate seeing us like this. We are supposed to be partners."
John let out a small sigh, his focus returning to his shirt as he buttoned the last one. "Amara, I'm not in the mood for this right now," he said flatly, standing up and reaching for his belt.
"John,"
she pleaded, moving closer.
"can't we just talk? I'm trying to apologize here. I don't want this tension between us."
"I heard you," he replied curtly, brushing past her to pick up his bag. "I have to go to work." The dismissiveness in his tone stung. Amara watched as he hurriedly finished getting ready, her attempts at bridging the gap falling on ears that seemed partially closed.
John, please.
She tried once more, but he cut her off with a quick, "We'll talk later," before stepping out of the room. Less than an hour later, John was out the door, leaving Amara standing in the living room, feeling deflated. She sank into a chair, clutching the edge of the dining table, her heart heavy. The rest of the day was depressing for Amara. However, she resolved she'd continue to make efforts to fix the issue between her and her husband. With that resolution, she brightened up with expectations when the husband comes back in the evening.